So, hello and welcome everybody to our series Tibet in Canada, Canada on Tibet. As you can see from the title, we aim to sit at the intersection of Tibet and Canada, giving voice to scholars based in Canada or from Canada studying this region, or Tibetan scholars based in Canada studying in the humanities. So, this is our program for the coming season. As you can see, we're nearly through to the end. We are now closing our little Montreal chapter after Kandro and today John Leavitt, who are both from or based in Montreal. And our upcoming lectures will move over to Vancouver with the last two upcoming lectures. So more details will follow. Today, I would like to introduce my friend and fellow GRIT member, John Leavitt, who's a professeur titulaire at the Department of Anthropology at the Université de Montréal. As you all know, he's a linguistic anthropologist who has worked for over 40 years on the epic, oracle texts, and oral traditions in the Central Himalayas, mostly in Uttarakhand in northern India. His research interests revolve around two keywords of linguistic anthropology: myth and poetics, and more broadly, the relationship between language, culture, and thought that he explored, for example, in his book Linguistic Relativities, Language, Diversity, and Modern Thought, published with Cambridge University Press in 2011. For decades and in 30 or so articles, he has edited, translated, and analyzed several epic texts and other oral tradition texts from the Central Himalayas, which led him to edit a book on the role of poetics in religious experience. See his volume Poetry and Prophecy, published with University of Michigan Press in 1997. In his long and productive career, he has produced many influential articles on diverse topics. I would just like to mention here his famous article, Meaning and Feeling in the Anthropology of Emotions, in American Ethnologist in 1996. It's an article that I frequently use in my classes. Other topics include comparative mythology, particularly of the South Asian and Celtic worlds, and identity and performance among Hindu migrants in Canada. He's now preparing a book-length study on the role of singers of tales in popular religion. So without further ado, please, John, take it all out. Away. Sorry, take it all away, not out.
Um, can I share the screen so people don't have to look at me? Okay, good, good, good. Okay, and I'll start with that same image there, and good. Well, first I want to thank my fellow members of GRITH, of the Groupe Interuniversitaire, Groupe de Recherche Interuniversitaire sur le Tibet et l'Himalaya, for the invitation to speak. And I particularly want to thank Natalia Mikhailova for putting together the lovely poster from materials that I furnished her. It's been a real joy to collaborate with in this project, in the GRITH project, and I hope that we can continue one way or another. Uh, Before I start, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm actually speaking from Ottawa. Also, this talk will not be about Tibet. It will be about the southern slope of the roof of the world, on the Himalayan side. What geographers call the Central Himalayas covers today's state of Uttarakhand in northern India. That's where it is. They've left Nepal as a blank, made up of the former kingdoms of Garhwal and Kumaon. That's Kumaon in the east and Garhwal in the west, as well as the farthest western part of Nepal. To situate the area, one can consider the Himalayas either uh, along the range, and there's an aerial, what I presume is an aerial photo of it, or from northwest to southeast, or across it from the lowlands to the highlands. I'll be going back and forth between these two angles of approach. Along the range, geographers distinguish, uh, oops, how do I go back? There we go. Geographers distinguish the western, central, and eastern Himalayas. The eastern basically is Nepal, which become more and more humid and warmer as you go to the southeast. But cutting across the mountains at virtually any point, there are pretty clearly defined ecological and cultural zones. Along the foot of the hills, on the far left of these are three slices from three places in Nepal. Um, Along the foot of the hills is a band of wet, swampy forest called the Tarai, inhabited by peoples with a hereditary resistance to malaria, who speak either the languages of the North Indian Plain or closely related languages. As you rise through forest and cross an initial range called the Mahabharat range in Nepal, the Gagar in Kumaon, elsewhere is called the Shivaliks. The populations of this zone, you enter what is called the Central Hill and Valley Zone. The populations of this zone are primarily Hindu, but with their own distinctive form of Hinduism. And they are primarily speakers of Indo-Aryan languages, but with their own languages. Uh, their languages are related to those of the west and east of them, forming what is called the Pahari branch of Indo-Aryan. Uh, and this is a linguistic map of the northern Indo-Aryan languages, and the Pahari languages are that long band in purple on the top. So it's clear that linguistically, the most important relations have been along the mountains in the same ecological zone, if you like. Still higher up are the Great Himalayas. Oops. Uh, and beyond them, the range on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau. In the valleys leading up to Tibet dwells another population, for the most part speaking languages closely related to Tibetan of the same family, non-Indo-European languages. In Uttarakhand, the dwellers on the lower slopes, the Paharis, call these people Bhotia, which is a word evidently related to the Tibetan name for Tibet, bird. Uh, Tibet itself is called Hundesh, the land of the Huns, by Paharis. So my concern today is with people of the Central Hill and Valley Zone, speakers of Pahari languages. From the Middle Ages on, these people formed a series of kingdoms along the Himalayan range. And there you are. There's Kumaon in the northwest. Garhwal is farther up here. This is what's called the 22 kingdoms, and then the 26 kingdoms in what is now Nepal. Uh, some of these kingdoms also controlled either a portion of the Terai or a portion of the high mountains, or in the case of Kumaon and Garhwal, both. During the second half of the 18th century, the kings of the small kingdom of Gorkha, which is in green here in central Nepal, began conquering their neighbors, eventually creating an empire that included not only what is now Nepal, which is all of this, but also Garhwal and Kumaon in the west. They had a war with the British East India Company, which led to a Nepali defeat in 1815, and they ceded Kumaon and Garhwal to be part of the British Raj. After decades of relative autonomy under the British, these two former kingdoms were joined to the United Provinces, which became the state of Uttar Pradesh at independence. And in 2000, after a long struggle for autonomy, the hill section of UP became the separate hill state of Uttarakhand. And this is a linguistic map of the state of Uttarakhand. And as you can see, it's dominated by Kumaoni and Garhwali. The official language of the state, however, is Hindi, is the language of the plains, and all education, commerce, political life takes place in Hindi, but people speak Garhwali or Kumaoni at home. The Paharis are, for the most part, hill Hindus. They have their own traditions and their own gods and goddesses alongside those of the pan-Hindu world. The rural population is divided into endogamous categories of Brahmins, Thakurs, who are the warriors, and low-caste people. In the cities, there's also a population of Vaishya merchants. One of the things that marks these societies is an extraordinarily rich set of oral traditions, songs, and stories. While many of these are known to the population at large, evidently some people are more interested in them than others, and they have been preserved primarily by a special category of drummers and singers of low or warrior status. The first publications describing Central Himalayan practices and traditions, which date to 1876 and 1884, respectively, are due to two foreign researchers. The first publication by a local scholar in this domain, as far as I can identify, is the Proverbs and Folklore of Kumaon and Garhwal of Pandit Gangadat Upreti, which would only appear in 1894. Today, I'll be contrasting the work of the two foreign scholars, who were contemporaries, and raise the question of the implications of their differences. But I will have a few words to say about the Himalayan scholar as well. One of the two foreigners was Edwin. That's just a shot of a, if you like, typical Kumaoni village. Edwin Felix Thomas Atkinson, a lawyer of Irish Protestant origins, member of the Indian Civil Service, and among other things, an important amateur entomologist and naturalist. There is a fish, Amblypharyngodon atkinsonii, named in his honor. For our purposes, he is above all the author of the monumental Gazetteer of the Himalayan Districts of the Northwest Provinces, which was published in 3 enormous volumes from 1882 to 1886, which covers the geography, geology, meteorology, botany, zoology, history, and religions of this part of the world. He finishes his discussion of religion with a presentation of the worship of local divinities and gives summaries of a number of myths about them, myths which at the time existed only in an oral form. Atkinson's book remains a fundamental source on both natural and cultural aspects of the region, and his versions of Himalayan myths, collected from local high caste scholars, mostly in the city of Almora, which was the capital of Kumaon. His versions continue to be cited in subsequent studies, often word for word and sometimes without attribution. The second author to be considered is the Russian Buddhologist and Indologist Ivan Pavlovich Minaev, sometimes called the founder of Russian language Indology, a student and then a professor at the Imperial University of St. Petersburg. Minaev was the first Russian scholar to study Pali and to study early Buddhist texts, and his Pali grammar is still in use. He made 3 journeys to India, and during the first, in 1874 and 1875, he crossed the Central Himalayan region. Like Atkinson, he worked with high caste scholars in the city of Almora in Kumaon. There's a shot of Almora, but also with singers and storytellers from a number of different castes. He collected folk tales and legends, including the myths of several local gods, transcribing them in their original Kumaoni language. In 1876, 8 years before the appearance of the first volume of Atkinson's Gazetteer, Minaev published a collection of these narratives in Russian translation, with an introduction and extensive notes, and a couple of appendices, in his book Indieskiy Skazki, Indian Tales and Legendi, Indian Tales and Legends collected in Kumaun, the first book ever published on the oral traditions of the Central Himalayas. The same year, he described his work as a field researcher in the essay Almorski Pievci in The Singers of Almora, published in the liberal review The European Messenger. Tragically, Minaev's archives, including his transcriptions in Kumauni, after being transferred from Russia to Germany for safekeeping, and then from Germany to England for safekeeping, appear to have been destroyed in the Blitz during the Second World War. So we don't have his Kumauni originals. Minaev's writings were available only in Russian for well over a century, and they remained almost unknown to the Hindi and English-speaking scholars of the region. Since the turn of the 21st century, an almost complete translation of his book has appeared in Hindi and a partial one in English. And Minaev's work is now regularly consulted. When I wrote that Minaev and Atkinson were contemporaries, that was an understatement. Both were born in 1840. Atkinson in a Protestant family of County Tipperary in Ireland, Minaev into the petty nobility of the Tambov region in the forest steppe of southern Russia. Atkinson studied at Trinity College in Dublin, where he won a prize in Sanskrit and a fellowship for students who had mastered the Irish language. So apparently he spoke Irish, but I don't find any use of Irish in his written work. At 21, he passed the very demanding Indian civil service exam and departed for India the next year. He would spend his entire career as a lawyer, magistrate, judge, and author of reports for Her Majesty's government. Here's Government House in Calcutta, where he worked. Minaev, for his part, studied Oriental languages at the University of St. Petersburg, where, after voyages to Western Europe to document ancient Buddhist manuscripts and attend courses by, among others, Bopp, the founder of historical linguistics, and Steinthal, the great linguist of the period, he was named professor and would go on to form an entire generation of Russian Indianists. Born in the same year, Minaev and Atkinson would also die in the same year, in 1890. Atkinson in Calcutta, Minaev in St. Petersburg. I said they were contemporaries. According to the journal of Minaev's third voyage to India, he and Atkinson actually met several times. On December 28, 1885, Minaev attended a dinner in Bombay, where the guests included, quote, one Mr. Atkinson, who I was told was an advocate, end quote. Minaev found the dinner, quote, dull enough. Quote, in the end, I almost fainted, owing to the foul smoke of cigar, unquote. While this first contact was not very auspicious, 3 months later, Minaev attended a meeting of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in Calcutta, in which the president of the society, the same Atkinson, made a speech that Minaev found, quote, highly interesting, saying, and this did surprise me, that people from northern climes could never colonize either India or any other tropical country. I was, Minaev writes, very glad of making his acquaintance. The next morning, Atkinson sent Minaev his book, one presumes a copy of the Gazetteer. Minaev went to thank him, quote, and caught him leaving for the office. He occupies a very big house. All the rooms are of imposing dimension, but without a punkah, a fan. The heat in them is intolerable, end quote. As far as I can tell, the next major work on Central Himalayan folk tradition was the book, The Proverbs and Folklore of Kumaun and Garhwal, by the Kumauni scholar Pandit Gangadat Upreti, published by the Lodiana Mission Press in 1894. Pandit Gangadat was born in Almora in 1834, 16 years before Atkinson and Minaev were born, to a family belonging to the highest stratum of Kumauni Brahmins. There is much less information about him available than about the other two. There are no pictures online that I could find. There is no Wikipedia article in any language about him. He served as an administrator, apparently a devoted and effective one, for the British government in Garhwal and Kumaon. In 1900, he published what remains a standard survey of the dialects of the Central Himalayan languages. In 1903, a description of land tenure systems. And in 1907, a catalogue and description of the martial castes of the region, arguing strongly for their inclusion in the armies of the British Empire. A grateful government rewarded him the title of Rai Bahadur. He died in 1910. A manuscript of his on the folktales of Kumaon and Garhwal is held at, of all places, the University of Minnesota Library, and some Indian colleagues and I are currently trying to get the library to make us a copy. I'm hoping in the near future to find out more about Pandit Gangadutt and to compare his point of view with those I am talking about today. I'll return to this point later. Minaev and Atkinson show profoundly different attitudes toward what is, in the end, virtually the same material. Atkinson labels the region's folk religion, including the worship of the gods whose stories he gives, as demonolatry. His observations show, he says, that, quote, the belief in demons and sprites, malignant and beneficent, has almost as firm a hold on the great mass of the people as ever it had, unquote. And he cites the character common to all demon worship in Kumaon. Atkinson sees this form of demonolatry as representative of, quote, the universal hierarchy of sprites and goblins common to all mountainous countries. And indeed, he says, to all barbarous peoples. Writing of healing practices, he comments, the sick persons are branded with hot irons, a rude form of cautery considered efficacious in most diseases by barbarous tribes. Regarding the beliefs of the mass of the population, Atkinson quotes approvingly the judgment of George William Trail, the former British commissioner for the region, who wrote in the 1820s, quote, an attempt to collect the numerous superstitious beliefs current in these hills would be an endless task, the result of which would by no means repay the labor bestowed, as these beliefs are for the most part rude and gross, displaying neither the imagination nor refinement in their texture. That's a quote from Trail from the 1820s. Atkinson himself concludes, the truth is that popular religion in these hills is a worship of fear. And though Bhagwan is named as the great god, he is supposed to allow mischievous and malignant spirits to injure the person and property of the people. The ruder forms are always worshipped with bloody rites, unquote. And enlarging his scope, he cites Monier Williams, the lexicographer of Sanskrit. Anybody who's worked on Sanskrit has used Monier Williams' dictionary. Monier Williams was also an advocate of the Christianization of India. And he says, I verily believe that the religion of the mass of the Hindus is simply demonolatry, unquote. Atkinson comments on this. This too is the result of our examination of the popular religion in these hills. Minaev, on the contrary, writes not of demonolatry, but of the naivete of the people, and of a presence of spirits in the landscape. Quote, each mountain, grove, cave, or stream around a small village has a distinct legendary history. The native fantasy of the hill tribes has peopled all the places with bhoots, that is to say, with ghosts, with phantoms. Like Atkinson, Minaev makes a connection with a more general notion of the character of mountain people, but in this case, there are no malicious sprites and goblins. As Minaev says, like all Highlanders, Gortsi, Kumaunis are a superstitious and poetic people. The word he uses narod for people. Quote, their stories and legends portray with spontaneous sincerity the spiritual image of this half-wild Highlander, Gortsa. Poetic, sincere, spiritual, spontaneous. The word Gorats, plural Gortsi, which in the 2015 translation of Minaev is rendered hill people, is ordinarily translated into English as Highlander, as I have done here, which makes one think first of the people of the Scottish Highlands, with all their romantic associations. Minaev's mountain model, in fact, seems Scottish or Swiss rather than a generalized barbarianism. And at one point, the comparandum even becomes Russian. Of a Himalayan singer of tales, Minaev writes, "His drawn-out, mournful singing greatly reminded me of the singing of Russian epics," and the word uses byliny. Bylina is the Russian epic. He continues, "The tempo would change but infrequently. The melody was simple, but at the same time elusive." End quote. When Minaev writes of the tales, legends, and songs that he's collected, he uses the terms oral literature, ustnaya literatura, and folk, literally national literature, narodnaya literatura. He offers these texts as, quote, specimens of contemporary Indian oral literature. He says that the, quote, oral literature of these people is unusually rich and varied. Evidently, the difference is striking between these two presentations of what is, again, essentially the same material. What lies behind it? We can suggest several distinctions in the background, duties, and what we can call ideologies of the two scholars. Atkinson is clearly a representative of government with a capital G. His express aim is to further the administration, in this case, of a frontier region relatively little known to the authorities. Minaev, while his travels were sponsored and supported by the Russian imperial state, to which he reported after each trip, Minaev presents himself in his journals as a visitor, a traveler, a solitary researcher who exploits his role as a foreigner to be able to speak directly with people of every social status and every caste. In particular, he shows a much greater interest for the Indians than for the British, whom he tends to find boring. Atkinson's book appeared in the series of Gazetteers of the Northwest Provinces, published by the Northwest Provinces and Oud Government Press. Certainly, it's an extraordinary gazetteer. The first two volumes give a rounded presentation of all aspects of the region, natural, historical, and religious. It's only the third volume that makes up the real gazetteer, an alphabetical list of localities with statistics and other kinds of information about them. The book continues to be reissued by Indian publishers in what are essentially photocopies of its original edition. Minaev, on the other hand, published his book of tales and legends in an academic collection, the Notes of the Faculty of History and Philology of the Imperial University of St. Petersburg. And it is indeed a book of tales and legends, of the kind folklorists had been producing throughout the 19th century, all through Europe and all through the colonies. The book has been reissued in Russian in 3 new editions, including, in 2006, a deluxe illustrated version that is part of the series Family Library, The Magic Room, and in 2021 in a series entitled Monuments of Literature. Franz Boas is supposed to have said, "The seeing eye is the organ of tradition." And it's clear that beyond what we would call their professional differences, the eyes, and certainly the ears, of our two protagonists had been trained very differently. Atkinson's eye was informed by the doctrines of cultural evolutionism, triumphant during this period, especially in the English-speaking world. And it sees Himalayan villagers as living survivals of a primitive stage of human development, a stage of savagery or barbarism of the same type that can be met with elsewhere in the colonized world and on its desert or jungle fringes. To understand Himalayan mountain people, Atkinson never uses the word Highlander. It suffices to identify them as frozen at a stage of barbarism, and all barbarians are alike. The Himalayan gazetteer's very format, its enormous scope, presupposes an evolutionist understanding of history. This presentation is also found in the works of American contemporaries of our protagonists, administrators and former administrators whose books cover precisely the geology and the flora and fauna of a given territory, and with them the customs, languages, and myths of the savage or barbarous tribes who inhabit it. This evolutionist assumption explains, for instance, why the artistic productions of these tribes were usually lodged in museums of natural history. Minaev, on the contrary, was formed in a philological and literary tradition. He had attended Hermann Steintal's lectures in Berlin, and he remained marked by the ideas of Wilhelm von Humboldt. In St. Petersburg, he gave courses on general linguistics, Obshtye Yazikoznaznya, that were Humboldtian and Steintalian in inspiration, and he produced a manual based on his teachings. His works and his voyages were sponsored not only by state institutions, but also by the great literary scholar A.N. Wieselowski, who saw the origins of literary art in the rituals and the poetic and mythic thought of peoples without writing. Remember how Atkinson quoted Monier Williams about how Hinduism was basically demonolatry? Monier Williams's professional archenemy was Friedrich Max Müller, the great defender of Indian civilization, and Minaev calls Müller a witty and brilliant writer. The dominant tendency in Minaev and the authors he admired, even if they do accept the notion of a hierarchy of civilizations with modern Europe at the top, is to see each language, each people, not as a token of a stadial type, as the evolutionists maintained, but as possessing its own distinctive and unique character, which deserves to be studied and developed. We have seen the indices of this holism and pluralism in Minaev's work. He says that every locality has a distinct legendary history. Kumaunis form a people, Narod, which translates the German Volk. I don't really have images for the rest of this talk, so rather than make you look at me, I will show some nice scenes of the Himalayas, as seen from Kumaun. There you have the city of Almora with the Himalayas behind it. The difference in attitude between the two scholars expresses two options that have been available to Western philosophy and the human sciences through the modern period, that is, at least since the 17th century. On one side, thinking in terms of a mechanical world run by universal laws. On the other, thinking in terms of a diversity of unique individuals, whether these are unique personalities, unique peoples and historical periods, or unique natural environments. It's an alternative refracted in the overlapping oppositions of scientific versus poetic thinking, universal and law-bound natural science versus pluralist historical science, Geisteswissenschaft, since this was most developed in Germany, explanation versus interpretation. Think of all the anthropological debates in the 1970s and 80s. Transitive versus expressive causality, in the words of the philosopher Louis Althusser. Even etic versus emic approaches to human cultures. It is easy for us, as modern Western scholars, to think in one of these two ways. Hard even to imagine other ways of putting things together. The scientific or scientistic way looks serious and realistic, but rigid. The expressive or romantic way looks rich and full of discovery, but hard to prove. Atkinson falls into the former pattern, Minaev into the latter. Atkinson plays the hard-headed scientist who comes equipped with a universal theory that explains cultural differences in advance. He already knows what to expect from backward and isolated mountain peasants. Minaev, on the contrary, presents himself as an open-minded and open-hearted romantic explorer who is seeking to discover and appreciate what is there to be discovered. In other words, in trying to characterize Himalayan oral traditions and present them to a Euro-American public, each scholar chooses one of the two easy-to-think options offered to modern Western thinking about virtually anything. This is why I use the word ideologies in the title of this talk. The two positions are marked over and over again in parallel arguments by distinctive tones of voice. Here, I'll give you a different picture. There's sunset. on the Himalayas, by distinctive tones of voice, notably in the themes that concern us here. Someone, let's call him or her the romantic or the nativist voice, claims to have discovered or rediscovered a non-canonical or pre-canonical tradition of forgotten or oral literature bearing non-modern, non-mercantile values. Against this, someone else, whom we can call the scientistic voice, claims that in fact the text in question is a fake, or that in fact there is no text, only the phantasmagorical result of a misunderstanding. With what Georges Dumézil called an aggressive euphoria, these hypercritics, as he called them, treat the defenders of the ancient or the oral or the authentic as innocents in the bad sense, dupes. The romantic accused of lack of critical acumen responds in turn with offended innocence. The data are there, the texts are there, they speak for themselves. And I've tried to give a list here of the sort of tones of these voices, and you may recognize some of these in debates that you have participated in or witnessed yourself. What marks the scientific critique is the easy and absolute certainty of the debunker, or as in Atkinson's case, the common sense administrator, equipped with what everybody who matters knows already is true. What marks the romantic under attack is a kind of outraged appeal to the facts. Perhaps you can think of other examples of intellectual battles involving these tones. In the case of Atkinson and Minaev, of course, there was no direct conflict between the two approaches. In a sense, they published past each other. But in many others, the conflict of tones of voice is explicit. Here are two brief examples drawing from studies in the Himalayas. Have I got time? Am I okay? Because I can also cut this bit.
No, absolutely. We are very relaxed with time. This is not the US. It's Quebec.
In 1988 and 1989, the German linguist Klaus Peter Zoller published two articles arguing that the Western Pahari language, Bangani, spoken in northwestern Uttarakhand, contained vocabulary that had been directly inherited, virtually unchanged from Proto-Indo-European, without passing through the transformations that marked all the other Indo-Aryan, indeed all the other Indo-Iranian languages. Were this the case, it would be a violation of the fundamental principles of historical linguistics. And in one of the articles, in fact, Zoller pronounced himself skeptical about such principles. The articles created something of a furor within linguistics and South Asian studies. Bangan, where they speak Bangani, is apparently a rather difficult area to access. And in Zoller's own word, the people there are fremdfeindlich, hostile to outsiders. In 1996, the Dutch linguist George van Driem and the Indian linguist Sunu Ram Sharma co-authored a piece ostensibly dismantling Zoller's claims by showing that his examples were either misinterpreted, erroneously transcribed, or unknown to actual Bangani speakers. The tone of this reestablishment of linguistic orthodoxy was sarcastic and dismissive. Zoller replied with a series of angry and bitter defenses, restating the evidence, and was supported by some Indian linguists. Nothing has been settled for sure. Apparently, without Zoller's knowledge or consent, his work has been promoted by people in the Hindutva movement, arguing for the Indian origin of all the Indo-European languages. Here's another case. In 1994, the German anthropologist Andras Höfer published a book of ritual texts from the Western Tamang people of central Nepal. The Tamang practice both Buddhism and their own traditional religion. In his book, Höfer consistently interprets the texts in terms of distinctively Tamang conceptions, giving ritual terms purely Tamang etymologies. A few years later, the French anthropologist Brigitte Steinmann wrote an absolutely scathing review of Höfer's book in the European Bulletin of Himalayan Studies. She said that Höfer had massively underestimated the influence of standard Tibetan Buddhism on the Tamang, that many of the ritual formulas that he had tried mightily to explain in purely Tamang terms were simply the usual expected Tibetan Buddhist phrases, of which Höfer appeared to be unaware. Höfer replied with great bitterness that Steinmann, who had worked with the Eastern Tamang, who were much uh, who were much more heavily influenced by Tibetan Buddhism than the Western Tamang, was projecting her own experience and a prejudice in favor of classical Tibetan culture and Buddhism onto the Western Tamang, who were far more autonomous and distinctive. If you just looked at the facts. Again, scornful debunking on the one side, outraged innocence on the other. Depending on the case, one can judge either side to have the better evidence and arguments. I tend to be sympathetic to Höfer in the one case and against and unsympathetic to Zoller in the other case. But that's because I do believe in historical linguistics as a field. Depending on the case, one can judge either side to have better evidence and arguments. Sometimes romantics or nativists really are naive, indeed gullible. Sometimes, on the other hand, the hypercritics, the scientific aggressive euphoria, is based on an unjustified oversimplification. But after seeing so many of these arguments take on the same emotional forms, just think of the fights since COVID between scornful medical professionals and outraged people who did their own research. It's worth looking for some other options than the scientific and the romantic. This is something I hope to look into, among other places, in the work of people who have grown up in a different tradition than the standard modern Western tradition. And one place to look will be, I hope, in the work of Pandit Gangadhar Preti. And what seems to me a contrast in his work between his overt voice and the content that he is actually conveying. Officially, Pandit Gangadhar was a good servant of government. Each of his books is dedicated to one or another British administrator, and his stated goal is to improve administration. But at the same time, the fantastic richness and detail of his data, whether on proverbs, dialects, caste organization, or I suspect on folk tales, if we can get hold of that manuscript, give the lie to his modest subaltern self-presentation. Unlike Atkinson, he is not an evolutionist who, because of this, already knows everything that matters. Unlike Minaev, he is not an innocent explorer of the mysterious and unknown. On the contrary, this is a world that he has known very well indeed for his entire life. Maybe looking at him and at figures like him will offer a way out of our endless repetition of the same arguments. Thank you. So we can end the sharing.
Okay, this is as you wish. We can also keep the Q&A recorded, but if you
Oh,
prefer the
no,
standard practice of not having it recorded, we can stop it here.
I don't mind having it recorded.
I find it so enriching. So actually, yes, let me just send a few notes here in the chat. I usually find it so enriching uh, that I like to keep it recorded. But if you don't
Sure.
feel comfortable,
I have no problem with that. I don't think
okay.
I'll embarrass myself to the extent that I would not want this to be preserved. I
Yes,
trust, knock on wood. Oh, yeah.
no, absolutely. It was perfectly tailored. Very, very clear demonstration. Thank you so much for preparing this for us.
Thank you very much, John. I will lead the Q&A session. Was very interesting, and the references to Russian academia, I especially appreciated it, and the words you pronounced in Russian, like it's so sweet. I like
Yes, I'm very good at faking. I don't know Russian, but I'm
but
very good at faking. Yeah,
but it seems like you know. It seems
I
like you
know. I know.
know.
My stepson pronounces French perfectly. but he doesn't know French at all. But everybody thinks he does because,
Well, you have a lot of potential if you wish to pursue
Thank you. Thank
the
you.
Russian language. So would anyone like to start with a
Well,
question?
since this is an interesting group who come from various different places, maybe people, I mean, I would be interested in people just sort of introducing themselves to each other because I think you might all have things to say to each other from here on in. Um, or I could introduce people, but I think people could introduce themselves because we have two people from Paris from one group, Zoom group that I participate in. We have uh, uh, or, or three. Sorry, that's because Camila Salvatore is here as well. We have one of my departmental colleagues, Karine Bates. We have two members of the Himalayan Research Group, the Quebec Himalayan Research Group, and Li Jing Peng has arrived from Ireland, who is a member of another group that I've been participating in to talk about semiotics. And Li Jing also worked on in the Tibetan region. So there.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you introduced us, so we can
Okay.
continue with the
Oh,
question.
and I don't know
Me,
Mir.
me neither.
I think it's Miranda. She's based in Montreal. She's interested in Tibetan studies writ
Mhm.
large, but yeah.
Um, yeah. So who would like to start with a question? Felix, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Well, thanks, John, for this presentation. I have nothing to do with the Himalayas or India. So I work, but I work in a mountain area in France, or what's considered as such. I imagine in compared to the Himalayas, it's not a lot because it only culminates at 1,200 meters in a place called Puy du Montoncel. It's the north of the Massif Central. And well, there is
Is
this
it
image.
Auvergne? Is it in the Auvergne?
It's in the Auvergne administrative region, but it's
Okay.
part of the Bourbonnais historical
Okay.
province.
Hmm.
So people there will tell you we're not Auvergnat. Um, and Well, maybe I could start off with one question. I was really interested with this image of the gorets, what we call montagnards in
Hmm.
France, and how it seems to have come from elsewhere and uh, be reinterpreted in this area. And I was interested in this, and it got me thinking of an article by someone called Philippe Martel, who's a historian, and that's called it was published in 2012, and it's called De l'Auvergnat au Kabyle, le recyclage d'un stéréotype dans l'Algérie coloniale. Um, so I thought that was one interesting thing. I'd like to hear what you think of it. And the second point was I don't know what the interests of Imperial Russia was. What were of course Atkinson's political background is relatively known. It's one of colonization, but how was Imperial Russia interested in the Himalayas?
Um, okay, yeah, for the first thing you raised, yeah, I mean, I don't know much about this. I will look at Martel's article. Uh, Clearly, in evolutionism, there's a relationship, or there's not a relationship, there's a parallel between European peasants in general and barbarians elsewhere. And
Mhm.
European peasants were often presented as survivals, as superstitious, uh, as basically survivals of an earlier barbaric period, and you find this in all the great evolutionists, in Tyler, and particularly in Fraser, um, and in Wilhelm Mannheim, who Fraser used a lot, and who writes about German and European peasants. And the part of the evolutionary model was that since autogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which they tended to believe, these earlier stages of thinking were also characteristic of children and of women, who were more emotional than adult men. So that there's an ostensibly scientific picture of savages, barbarians being the equivalent of children and women, being the equivalent of European peasants, which has a coherence to it, which made it extremely attractive to people and had this scientific air about it. I'm there are two views of mountain people, of course, depending on which angle you're coming from. The word Highlander has such strong romantic connotations. In French, when you're talking about the Scottish Highlanders, is the word used montagnard?
I don't think so.
On parle des hautes terres, I think, de l'Écosse. See, and that's interesting because Gorats can be translated as either one, but if you just look in the dictionary, it's Highlander that comes out. Of course, Gora is a mountain. So you do have these very, very intensely romantic associations. In English, with the word Highlander, there is no equivalent in French, as far as I know, of Highlander. And of course, you are all very, the people here, the Francophones here, are very aware of the place of the Highlander in the writings of Sir Walter Scott, on television. So I don't know what was exported to Kabylie in this article, to Algeria, by the French, in terms of the expectations of people who live in mountains. Often, the colonial powers thought people who lived in mountains were more honest, healthier, more honest, and certainly this was the case in India. There's a lot of fondness of the British authorities for the mountain people versus the plains people. The plains people are considered treacherous, sneaky, unreliable, whereas the mountain people, a lot of administrators thought the mountain people were more like, European mountain people, and admired them for that. But I don't know, this is a whole field to investigate that I don't know very much about.
Can I interject just a
Yes,
few words?
please.
I have the impression that in France, but Felix may correct me, there is this image in the Alps, right, of the Crétin des Alpes.
The Crétin des Alpes.
Yeah.
Crétin des Alpes.
The
some idiot, the dummy.
Yes, because of interbreeding. A lot, well, supposed interbreeding,
right?
But ideas of isolation, they are like a little bit on the savage side, not the civilized side, because they're out of society, not cultured, they're onto themselves, they're from the old times. So I think images, maybe we could look at it in Switzerland as well, like people who live in the really high pastures are usually looked down upon by people living more in the valleys. Like they're not quite together type of people. So
that's certainly the case in the United States with Appalachian people, with hillbillies, who are supposed to who are supposed to marry their cousins, and have all kinds of, they're treated as idiots in a lot of the discourse.
The history of Crétin des Alpes apparently there was a condition that was widespread in the 19th century in the Alps, which was a lack of I don't know how you say it in English,
Iodine.
iodine,
Oh, iodine.
iodine, yeah.
Oh.
Which would affect them and cause growth, impair growth. And so that was one thing. In what I read, for example, in the very first rapport from the first préfet of the Département de l'Allier after the revolution, he draws on this opposition between the lowlands and the mountain, where the people in the lowlands are considered more corrupt or urban,
yes.
and the people in the highlands are both considered tougher, but also they have a clan structure.
Yes, they're probably stubborn.
Yeah, but also organized, and they work a lot. They work well.
I mean, and, it's like the model is the noble savage, right? And they're or the monstrous savage, and peasants and hill people in the global urban imaginary of Europe are a step or two toward that noble savage in both ways. Also, Kumaunis, I mean, hill people are not considered very bright. And, I was told of this standard joke in which somebody comes down from the mountains to a big city and is incapable of crossing the road because the cars are going by and just can't figure out how to get across the road. And if anybody spent time in an Indian city, it's not always easy to cross the road, but the image of the poor Pahari standing there, mouth open, just frozen, is one that Paharis themselves are very aware of. The question of Imperial Russia, again, I don't know much about it. My basic source is Kim by Rudyard Kipling, is the novel, and the whole second half of the novel is about fighting these Russian schemes to destabilize the British Empire. Certainly, the Russians had presented themselves as having great admiration and love for the poor Indians who were being oppressed by the terrible British. And they presented themselves as far more sympathetic to the Tibetans and to the Indians than the actual colonizers were. But that's, of course, because they had no stake in it. But what was called the Great Game in the sort of middle and late 19th century was the struggle between the British and the Russians, who were right there, on the other side of. And apparently, the way Afghanistan was created as a country, with that little tail that goes up into the Pamirs. Afghanistan is basically a kind of globular country with a little bit of a tail that goes up to the northeast, and that's to prevent any direct contact between the Russian Empire, the British Empire, and China. They all touch on the Pamir, but particularly the Russians and the British never touch at any point. But I mean, there is a huge historical literature on this. Li Jing had her hand up.
It was Li Jingpeng. But I just wanted to add that all that you say, John, that's right. Like there was this big game between Imperial Raj, British Raj, and Russian Empire. They both wanted to establish their influence in Central Asia.
Yeah.
Li Jing?
Oh, hello everyone. Well, John, I haven't seen you actually for a while, so it's nice to see you. And I haven't had the chance to present my new office to you when I moved to this new job, and you see the Bhutanese king on on the wall, because our associate professor Kimbo is in Bhutan doing his ERC big project, so he gives the money source to us for safekeeping, and so I'll just quickly explain why I'm sending a file in the chat. It's not related. I will ask my question in a minute. So I think because this group here, so I'm sending in the information of our 2026 Summer School of Historical Linguistics here. So this year our Center for Asian Studies in Trinity College Dublin organized a historical linguistics summer school for Sino-Tibetan linguistics, Trans-Himalayan linguistics family. So when we organized it, we thought if 5 people turn out, it's a success. We ended up 90 people come. 90 people came to the summer school. It was nice, and there are people from Canada as well, from University of Toronto, and a lot of scholars from the US, and most of them are from Asia and Europe. So all the information are in the documents. The highlight would be a reconstruction course on Proto-Kober. It's a group of languages in India. And for anyone who's interested in Tibetan languages, Joanna Bielak will continue to do her lecture on old Tibetan grammars, and also the reading of old Tibetan annals. So I took this lesson last year. It was fantastic, and I learned a lot. Okay, I'll stop. If you're interested, you're welcome to look at the document. And also I saw some familiar faces here. Isabel, hello. And Umila, you are the organizer, you are the convener of Elan this year, right? So yeah, so I saw her in our Elan workshop, the network of linguistic anthropologists in Europe.
Yes.
Yeah, so nice to see you here. So John, it was a fantastic lecture. So I'm just happy that I skipped 1/3 of my Tibetan colloquial lesson to join your talk, and which I learned far more. It sounds like the situation, like if I do a little bit comparison of the Celtic folklore and linguistics you also work on, it sounds like the comparison of the early 20th century folklore traditions of Celtic system, and also people like Rudolf Thurneisen, who does hardcore historical linguistics on Celtic languages, right? I hope the comparison is valid. And so my question would be, because I try to look for Minaev's work, but it seems like it's pretty difficult to find. So if I actually want to read it, what would be the sources to find? And I also want to know the nature of his works. Are they like hardcore historical linguistics work? Like,
well, I mean, as I said, he did a Pali grammar. He's done, I mean, most of his work is on early Buddhism. And I mean, I haven't really looked into that side of it particularly. I know the Pali grammar has been translated into English, and now there's a translation of part of the folklore book into English, which leaves out the myths and the legends. It's basically sort of international folk tales. And that one I don't know, you'd have to order it from India. But I can send you the references for that. But I don't know. I mean, there's an article about him on Wikipedia that gives you, the basic information. I'm also struck by the fact that if you look at these two guys, there's one picture of each of them, just one, but there's
just
one.
Okay.
And if you go to Upreti, there's none. But yeah.
Yeah. So early Buddhism studies, so are they textual studies?
Yes.
Or okay, so they are not purely oral studies.
They're not at all oral
Uh,
studies. No, 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 no.
oh,
Most of his work is textual.
and
This
there
was
is.
unusual. His travels and
Mm,
his deciding to write down these folk tales. Most of his work
mm,
is on ancient texts. I think he might
mm.
have done a history of Buddhism as well.
Uh, I'm just looking at his Wikipedia page. There's a. It seems like there's a German version of his works.
There may well be. Yeah.
Buddhism, Untersuchungen und Materialien. Yeah.
Mhm.
Maybe. Okay, maybe I'll try to look into it. I'm
Mhm.
just maybe a more general question would be now because I'm thinking about this summer school and I'm in this Department of Linguistics. My direct colleagues are all hardcore historical linguists. So I rather want to hear your opinion of such researchers' value to the development of the scholarship of European historical linguistics in general, or how do you see the influence of that or impact of that on probably the development of anthropology as well at that period of time?
I guess my question is which work? Um, I mean, all over the
Uh,
world, people, a couple of Western countries had colonized most of the rest of the world. So there was a massive amount of new information coming in about human diversity uh, coming into Europe at at this time. Um,
yeah, maybe let's focus on Central Himalayan, sources. Because if we stretch it to around the world, there are way
sure.
too many perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Mm.
I think it had very little impact on the general development of the field. Evolutionism was already well established at the time Atkinson wrote, and he's used mostly to find out about this region. He's not a theoretician, particularly, and the point of the Gazetteer was to make it easier for administrators to administer this area. But in order to do so, he just covered everything in the Gazetteer. I think Minaev, the book on folktales by Minaev, um, was put on a shelf along with folktales from all over the world, uh, as far as I know. Um, and you did have this big difference between a sort of essentially evolutionist approach, which saw itself as a natural science of humanity, looking at the development of human societies, human cultures, in the same way that an evolutionist will look at the development of plants or the development of animals, uh, versus the folklorists, whatever their opinion of the stuff that they were recording, there was a sense that this was the heritage of humanity, the patrimoine that needed to be preserved and collected because it would disappear soon. Um, and then that was carried over in the early 20th century into Boasian anthropology, but folklore has never stopped. And the documentation of of smaller languages. I mean, Kumaoni has, I believe, about 1 million speakers now. And to someone who works in India, that's tiny. That's a teeny tiny language. For someone who works in North America with indigenous North American languages, that's just amazingly wonderful. I mean, it's huge, you know. Um, yeah, no, um, I don't see this work as having a lot of impact on the overall development. It's more a reflection of the overall development just in terms of theory, of theoretical approach. You know, they're not cited very often by, you know, in sort of major works of anthropology or folklore.
Thank you, John. I think I agree with you that it's like these works that just like examples of what is believed to be like how the anthropology developed in Britain. Like it was with the practical purposes of proper administration of those areas, which needed like you get in contact with those people whom you have never met, and you had to establish proper relations, and you need practical things for that. And in Russia, that's true that there was no anthropology; it was ethnography. So those people were just collecting what they saw as curious, interesting. The Museum of Ethnography, it's actually a museum of curiosities.
Yes.
It collected the people who worked there, who assembled the collection. They were just choosing different peculiar things which are, you know, which could be interesting for a museum. And that's the same with the folklore. So it's just interesting.
Except Natalia, but Russian administrators were administering Central Asia, Siberia.
Exactly, but there was a Royal Geographic Society. It's a different institute. There was a Royal Geographic Society, and they were sending the missions to Central Asia, to Tibet, and so on. And those people, like the geographers, their purpose was more focused on this practical geography, history, and traditions in the way how people not just sing their songs, but in a way how they communicate with each other, how you should properly introduce yourself, how you should probably, I don't know, address elders and so on.
Huh. So that covers a lot of what we call anthropology or ethnology.
Yeah, but again, like it's very different. So there was history, geography, and then there is ethnography. Yeah, which is also which can we can include folklore there. So, but yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to confirm that you have presented it to my impression very correctly. And if anyone else would like to ask a question,
Isabel has been trying.
and Durmila as well. Yeah. Who would like to go first? Isabel?
As you wish. Okay, fine, let's go. Thank you very much. That was very clear. So I have a comment and a question. My comment is this would be wonderful teaching material for actually undergrad level anthropologists to display or to show, to exemplify to them two different theoretical, even intellectual projects on how to approach alterity and ethnography in general. So if I use your labels, the romanticist view and the scientist view, and this is just so rich to think about us, you know, what are we doing now? Because, you know, we have to think about our preconceptions, a priori ideas of, you know, what is interesting about the other, you know, and what should and what are the implications and the underlying um, um, structural, if you wish, political, economic assumptions that bear these projects.
Part of this is part of a larger project to argue that the modern West has a culture too.
Mhm.
You know, that we are not beyond culture, that we have just as specific expectations, tendencies as the Balinese of Clifford Geertz or, you know, or the Nuer or anybody else. It's just that ours are on a larger scale. And I see them as intimately tied up with our daily way of living in capitalism, in a capitalist society. And I personally consider Karl Marx to have been the greatest ethnographer of modern Western society, what that's worth. Anyway, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
And its tensions. Yes. So, but yeah, no, that's really fabulous. I hope you publish it so we can use it to exemplify that. So my question was more about the relevance of those archives, if I can name those two sets of works, archival research about what they found. Yeah, today. Have you, in your fieldwork, encountered local or Indian scholars who read those books and what do they think about them? I have in mind actually a particular Russian traveler to Tibet called Nicolas Röhrig.
Oh, yeah, of
I
course.
probably don't
Yeah.
pronounce his name very well, who went to collect the text for the ritual of the cutting of the stone on the stomach of a ritual officiant, right? There's a demon uh, ensnared in a stone, put on the stomach of a ritual specialist, and then through Buddhist incantations and visualizations, there's an action of breaking the stone, which liberates the demon from harming the society at large. Well, he studied and he actually translated the whole text and described the whole actions in a very ethnographic or Russian ethnographic or very particular way. And this was published in 1932. In the 1990s, because of the
In
very,
Russian,
in English, actually. Well, I
in
have it in
English.
English in 1932. It may have
Okay.
been translated from Russian. This much I don't know.
I'm always curious about, for instance, his relation with the Soviet Union. Was he a Soviet? I don't know. Or was he in exile? Was he?
I would not know that. Natalia, maybe?
He actually, I think he moved to, like when there were this Soviet developments, he moved
Mhm.
to India and he lived
Oh,
in India for a very long time with his wife, and his one of his sons is also considered to be what we call Vostokoved, like the person who studies the Orient, the
uh-huh,
Orientalist. Yeah, so
uh-huh.
his son was also one of the
Sviatoslav.
scholars, Svetoslav.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Mm. But to come back to the story and the relevance of your archives or those sets of books, right? So this was 1920s, 30s. And
Mhm.
then because of Chinese repressive policies, these rituals got lost. And then there's a Western traveler anthropologist in the 1990s called Wolfgang Kahlen. He had read this text. And so he
Mhm.
took this text to that village and he said, "Do you still do this ritual?" And they said, "No, we've forgotten it." And they said, "But here is the text." And so they read the text and somehow found a way to retranslate into Tibetan. I don't know exactly how it went. And it somehow revitalized that
Mhm.
ritual in that village. And so my question is the following. I don't know how quickly those aspects of culture are vanishing in Kumaon and these areas, but would local scholars be interested in reading all of these accounts of last century, I mean, over a century ago? How relevant would that be? What would they think? How reliable would they think these sources are? Um, or they're not aware of those sources and they don't really care? Or
Yeah,
Um,
sorry, John. Isabel, which village are you referring to in Tibet?
it's called The Ritual of Something Cutting the Stone by Nicolas Röhrig, 1932. I can send the reference to you if you want. I'll
Yeah,
send it
yeah,
in the
thank
chat.
you.
I'll
yeah.
look it up
Thank
in
you,
the
thank
chat.
you. Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Well, you have to distinguish between people who live in villages who are following, who are farmers, um, and elementary school teachers, and scholars. I mean, university professors, people in the universities in the towns, in Almora, in Nainital, in Pauri, in other villages. The A lot of the work on folklore in Kumaon and Garhwal, there are many, many books in Hindi that are sort of overviews of folklore of Kumaon, folklore of Garhwal. In fact, across India, you have these in the regional language, uh, often by people in Hindi language and literature departments. who do their PhD on a regional tradition, and then have careers working largely on this stuff and publishing both in Hindi and in English. Kumaoni is not, and Garhwali are not used as scholarly languages at this point. People do write poetry in Kumaoni and Garhwali, which is published. Obviously, there are all kinds of songs in Kumaoni and Garhwali. But these scholars, oh, they know Atkinson very, very well. In fact, this is a little bit disturbing, is that often in a book in Hindi, you'll find the telling of a myth and it's not attributed. And you wonder, where did he get this? Where did she get this? And it turns out it's simply translated straight out of Atkinson, like virtually word for word. Other people are doing field research and are going out into villages and recording people and transcribing them. But no, there is the local scholars are very, very aware of the literature that goes back to Atkinson. They weren't aware of Minaev because they didn't have access to Minaev. But now with translations of Minaev into Hindi and English, he's become part of the canon. And there really is a canon. There's a published canon, largely in Hindi, but also in English, on folk traditions in Uttarakhand, in Garhwal and Kumaon. But it's not read by villagers who are singing the songs and practice. A lot of the singers are virtually illiterate. No, it sounds like the situation in Tibet. I mean, Hinduism. Now, there may be more repression with the Hindutva government in India. They may decide that, well, for instance, a fundamental part of this religion has been sacrifice. Sacrifice of chickens, sacrifice of goats, male goats. And sacrifice is now illegal because Hindutva governments think sacrifice gives India a bad name and we're all really supposed to be vegetarians. And certainly they don't want Hinduism as a religion associated with blood sacrifice. And sacrifices are going on all the time still, but they're not called sacrifices anymore. They're called picnics. You go along to just outside a temple of one of the local gods with a beautiful. I mean, I just the anecdote is I'm sitting at a tea stall and a couple of guys come walking by with an enormous, beautiful black he-goat, billy goat, who's clearly not been castrated. It's very obvious, and he's just the perfect victim for a sacrifice. And he's going along, and I say to them, "Hey, you going to do a sacrifice?" They say, "Oh, no, 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 picnic." Picnic. So they're going to kill the goat. They're going to eat the goat. They're going to do it, and they're going to probably leave the appropriate parts for a priest, and the whole thing will be offered to the god. It'll be a sacrifice in every way, except they'll call it a picnic because it's that way. It's not religious. It's a little bit like I figure in Quebec with the laws repressing, religious gear. As a Jew, I assume I'm allowed to wear a big cross, because I can say it's not religious. I'm not a Christian. I just think it's pretty. It's that kind of thing. No, so there hasn't been. On the other hand, there has been revival of some practices that were lost, not usually due to repression, but due to economic factors and things like that. The Tibetan situation sounds much more like the situation among indigenous American groups who have lost a lot of their languages and their practices, and who are now going to the work of Edward Sapir and Franz Boas and to find out what their languages were. And this is here the work of linguists and anthropologists has proved to be very, very valuable and helpful. But the Himalayan situation, there is a tendency to Sanskritize. There is a tendency to say that some of these gods are really just incarnations of higher Hindu gods. And there are debates about this that often line up along political lines. No, but no, I don't have cases like your rediscovery of Rurik. Generally, these things continue to be practiced. I mean, one case in point, when I was doing my long period of 2 years there in the early 80s, one of the practices is to drum and sing. A professional singer-drummer will sing in the fields for the transplantation of rice, of wet rice cultivation, when all the women in the village are working together to transplant, bent over. It's hard work, pulling up the rice and transplanting it, which is necessary. It has to be done fast. Also, it's done in the higher terrain for the weeding of the millet, which has to be done collectively very, very fast. And there too, the bards, you can call them bards, play their drums and sing the epics of ancient heroes. This had virtually disappeared in the region where I was, but people remembered it. So I was able to do a fake, to hire a bard for these practices and have it done. But I don't think it's held. On the other hand, apparently my presence in the early 80s and the fact that I was showing so much interest in these in certain rituals and in the practice of drumming and singing did inspire at least one young guy to take that up. I mean, he remembered me, and he's now a practicing bard.
Yeah. So you would say that they don't, even though they kept the traditions alive, there's no sense of traditions even waning or changing. In discourse, they still say, we're still doing the same thing we've always done. And then they don't want to look back into the past.
Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, no, the actual performers, the singers, they get paid. They're professionals. They're rather jealous of each other. They got their teaching from their teachers, and their teaching is unique and is the best. I'd say overall, and they'll very often start rituals with naming legendary precursors to them. So no, they're not particularly interested in. They're masters. They're masters of an art. They're not particularly interested in reading what some other master or somebody who claims to be a master said to another, to some scholar a long time ago. Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Urmila wanted to ask something.
Yes.
Yes. Is there time?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, John, for that fascinating presentation. Very entertaining as well, I have to say. I have a question. Well, I have many questions, but I'm going to pose just one about the ideologies, the notion of ideologies as you presented. And so you have, on the one hand, the scientific evolutionist model that's used, and then on the other, the idea of the folk and rooted in Humboldt and so forth. But I was wondering what if there were maybe some dialogical relations between these two sets of ideologies and caste ideologies, because the issue of caste kept coming up in your talk at various points. And you mentioned that, well, in the present day, as I understood it, it's the oral traditions are kept alive by drummers who are either warrior or low caste. So you said
Mostly low caste.
okay.
Mostly low caste. Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned that Atkinson, if I understood it correctly, spoke primarily to high caste informants,
Both, well, yeah, that's right. That's right.
and Minaev as well. Is that correct?
Minaev also talked to actual singers. He makes a point
Okay.
of it, who were not high caste.
Okay.
He had a much broader spread. Now, Atkinson, I don't know about, I mean, we know that among his most important informants were high caste Brahmin people who had themselves an interest in the folk traditions,
Right.
um, and who knew the folk traditions well,
Right.
including Upreti himself, who was a source for
Right, and
Atkinson.
that's what I was coming to as well. So on
Uh-huh.
the one hand, you have the caste of the informants,
Yes.
which there might be high caste, in which case they're speaking of the low caste people who,
Yes.
I don't know, who preserve these traditions. So you have the, it's already at a remove. And then with the Gangadat Upreti,
Hmm.
Pandit Gangadat, uh, well, he himself is high caste,
Hmm.
and you described his voice in his writings as that of a modest subaltern administrator of the British Indian government and
Yes.
so forth. But he was also located within this caste hierarchy, right?
Yes.
And so, yeah, well, I guess his voice would be more complicated than the others, but in that sense.
Well,
But
also because he wasn't brought up in a Western, he wasn't Western trained. He didn't go to Trinity College or to the
right,
University of St. Petersburg.
yeah. But yeah, I wonder if, well, maybe there are three sets of ideologies there that are in dialogue or
Mhm.
interfering with each other. I don't
Yeah,
know. Yeah, I was just wondering if you had
it's quite possible.
something to say.
Actually, he gets criticized now for that book on folklore uh, and proverbs because a lot of the proverbs say really bad things about low caste people.
Hmm.
Okay, and he
Wait, who
just
gets criticized?
Upreti
Okay,
in his book on proverbs and folklore
right,
from 1894, because it's a
right.
list of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of proverbs, and many of them he attaches a little story explaining the origin of the proverb. And some of these are just, I mean, as anywhere else in South Asia, there's a Dalit movement in Kumaon,
Hmm.
uh, and people don't like these. He uses the word for low caste people that is now a vicious, bitter insult, which used to be the standard word used by non-low caste people for low caste people. Um, it's 1894. And, what's his own opinion? Not clear. What he's giving us is the sort of respectable upper caste view. And most of the proverbs, I assume, come from upper caste people.
Hmm.
Um, so there's an issue. The book on the martial castes, in which he's very concerned about um, having the British government recognize the excellent martial qualities of Kumaunis and Garhwalis. I mean, most of it's obviously the warrior caste, but he also makes a big argument that some Brahmin groups have a martial history too. They were generals in the armies and things like that, and they should be considered. He also says that low caste people might be good buglers and might be good as sort of support staff. Okay. And then he says, of course, I haven't even talked about the merchants in the towns because they have no martial tradition at all. Uh,
Hmm.
so we get a lot of the sort of what are still the common prejudices and the common stereotypes that are still circulating in this part of the world about different kinds of people.
Right,
So yeah, he's coming at it from an entirely different uh, angle.
right.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Regime.
Li Ting has left us.
Mhm.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? Otherwise, we should thank John for his wonderful,
Thank
generous
you.
presentation and sharing with us. It was very, very interesting and lovely to have you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Fabulous,
Nice to
erudite.
see you all again, and nice to see people from different
Thank you.
Yeah, we've had a
spheres.
latecomer. Sorry about the time,
Mhm.
because of time zones and jet lag and everything.
Yeah.
Sometimes people